The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Looking at the wrong VU meters there. I didn't see anything jumping. Anyway, good evening. Good to see you all here. Have you all here. It's good for me to be here if I get my head together. This is a live call-in program. Feel free to call in and share your thoughts, questions, challenges, or questions on the topic of the evening. 343-9927, 343-9927. And with me tonight, as usual, is Lang Baker, my faithful co-host, I suppose. How you doing, Lang?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty okay now that we're off and rolling. Okay, well, tonight's topic is... Lang and I are going to discuss, or we've been talking about, whether or not America is presently being made great again, or if maybe something else is happening. And Lang, I thought I'd start off the show by talking about a couple of things with the United States that have been going on for quite some time, actually. I'm guessing for about the past 30 years, really, that I know of. But first off, I wanted to say I did not intend for this show to be all about bashing America or anything like that, but I really couldn't find that. I couldn't find anything that was good to say or hopeful for us. But, you know, I didn't spend a whole lot of time looking for it. But anyway, I want to talk about a Council on Foreign Relationship report regarding America's infrastructure first. And we're talking about making America great again. Is America becoming great again? Does it need to? Is it still great? Or whatever. But this CFR, Council on Foreign Relations article, I took some notes here from it, and here's a few excerpts. It states here that the United States generally lags behind its peers in the developed world. According to the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report, in 2016, the United States ranked 10th in the world in a broad measure of infrastructure quality, down from 5th place in 2002. It talks about traffic congestion costing $120 billion a year, airports, the poor quality or the poor state of our airports costing about $35 billion a year. And they state here that our bridge and roads are estimated at requiring $1.5 trillion more than what is projected from now until 2025. To get things in shape, or the American Society of Civil Engineers, which compiles an annual report every year since 1980, in their 2017 report rated us as D, our America's infrastructure as a D, meaning that, quote, the conditions are mostly below standard, exhibiting, quote, significant deterioration, and with a, quote, strong risk of failure. And it just seems as though, the United States, our infrastructure, I know, has been declining for a long time. Ever since I was a right-wing zealot, I cited that as proof, as that government control was not working, that, free market would fix it and all that. And that's all, questionable, I guess, and beyond the point right now. But I know from, at least 30 years ago, it's been in bad shape. Our infrastructure has been in bad shape. And education, too. America's no longer the world leader in education either. I think we're rated at 15th in the world, and we're ranked 31st in math of the 35 industrialized nations of the OECD, which we've talked about before. We're 37th in the world on healthcare and 35th, dead last of the OECD countries in healthcare effectiveness and cost. Anyhow, so what does this all have to do with making America great again, Lang? What effect is it having?
Well, we can see some effects right here in Louisiana. I just heard a story the other day about how the impact of the deteriorating bridges in this state are the adverse effect that's having on our agricultural industry, on getting, for example, getting the sugar cane from the fields. Because of the poor condition of the bridges, they can't carry as heavy a load across them, and so they either have to reduce the amount of load they put when they're bringing them from the fields, which means more trips, or else they have to find another route that'll take a lot longer.
Right.
In more hours and more labor.
And it's because these bridges, I think you said, were built 40 years ago or 50 years ago when they were designed.
What I heard on the story was they were designed, they had a 50-year lifespan design, and they're 60 years old.
Yeah, and that's kind of like with our interstate system too. They weren't when they were designed. It wasn't expected that we'd have all this traffic, but because it was built, we have more traffic, and so it's wearing out faster, way faster than anybody anticipated, and we're not keeping up with the maintenance.
Yeah, we had an earlier show where we talked about the road conditions and how the impact from heavy loads is so much greater than the amount of taxes that are paid by those vehicles.
Right, but of course
that they're causing a lot more damage than their proportional contribution to the fund for maintaining them.
Right, but anytime anybody calls for more taxes, a rise in the gasoline tax in this state, it's shouted down because it'll cost jobs. But if you don't have any roads...
Yeah, well, I saw a similar story recently about the airports and the fees that are charged for the commercial airlines that all the trailing passengers are paying is covering the vast, like the upper 90% of the contributions to that maintenance fund, whereas the private jets of the corporate executives are paying a minuscule amount, whereas they're responsible for a lot larger proportion.
Really?
Of the expense. Yeah, so it's another case of the people who are making the most use or causing the most damage or degradation of the infrastructure component are the ones paying the least. The ones who are benefiting the most, and they're from those who are most able to pay to keep it up, but the rest of us are left holding the bag.
Well, yeah, okay. Well, I think it's obvious. We know that education, the lack of, or the decline in our educational standards or our ranking in the world, I'll put it that way, is hurting us globally as far as competition, but also the infrastructure, like we're saying, is also inhibiting our or hurting our status in the world for competitiveness globally. A little bit about infrastructure. Isn't the Trump administration going to fix that? Aren't they implementing some spending?
Well,
increased spending?
There's been talk about an infrastructure bill in Congress, and there's not been any details, but from some of the stories that have come out, it's going to be proposed to be a so-called public-private partnership, which is suggested will result in a lot more toll roads.
Yes, and actually I've been reading where Trump is kind of stepping back from the public-private partnership, leaning more toward, I think, cutting the business out, I think, but I'm not sure about that, but chances are, based on what you're saying, going to toll roads and whatnot, he's going to just turn it over to the free market, so to speak.
That's what some of the talk has been,
right,
on speculation about what will actually be presented, but nothing has been presented yet.
I'm a proponent of toll roads. I think it provides lots of benefits, but it's tough. I mean, as rural as Louisiana is, and indeed as much as the Midwest is, I don't see where local rural roads can be toll roads. I mean, that's fine. I think that's the bulk of the roads in this country. So I don't know that toll roads could help it. But we're kind of getting off track on that. And what I've read about the proposals for infrastructure spending is Trump is talking about increasing some spending, but he's going to cut it elsewhere. He's not really going to increase the budget for infrastructure. And that's just, we're not talking about the water supplies or waste treatment either, which we've talked about before on this show, are deteriorating all over this country.
Yeah, we've had some examples of
Water
local
mains
municipal
breaking.
water systems having problems right here in
Yeah,
Louisiana.
and water mains in brand new subdivisions breaking and creating sinkholes and swallowing houses and things like that. It's happening a lot more frequently than most people realize. We're just not talking about it. What about other things affecting us? What have you learned about science? How is America doing with science research and spending?
Well,
and
it's
stuff
another
like that?
place where we've been cutting back in funding basic research and in providing educational opportunities for the sciences as well. That part of the immigration plan is to they've been putting up barriers to visas. For instance, saw one mention of Iranian students being excluded from getting education visas where they had been a source of software engineers that have contributed to the economy in this country.
Yeah, well, the U.S. is cutting back quite a bit, and now I am going to start focusing on the Trump administration because he has made his whole goal really to basically pull America out of foreign involvements and spending and things like that. Has he not?
Well, we're getting into what the international stage looks like in comparison of what the future holds for the United States versus other countries around the world. And Trump has made a point of his America First policy of taking steps to withdraw from participation in the international arena in a lot of different areas, including like the Paris Climate Accords and his challenges to NAFTA and other trade deals, and
Pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, economic deal.
And China, which has been moving forward in a lot of fronts internationally, both in the strength and growth of its economy as well as in its programs of foreign assistance and foreign aid. We talked about their one road, one belt program on an earlier episode of this show.
Yeah, I want to talk some more about that. I've got some facts on it from an investment house that I found. But yeah, as the U.S. is cutting back on its global commitments and global investment, things like that, spending on the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and things like that, China is stepping up. And
China was moving forward on already, and then with the new
With
Trump
us,
policy, that just opens the door wider for them to step into the gap there.
Yeah, and I want to remind the listeners you're listening to A Pause for Thought with Wayne Parker and Lang Baker. This is a live call-in show, 343-9927, 343-9927. We're discussing whether or not America is being made great again, or maybe something else could be going on. And the idea for this show was prompted by an article in the New Yorker by Evan Osnos titled "Making China Great Again." And the gist of what he says, Lang, as I'm sure you know, is that like we're saying here, that as America pulls back from the world, China is stepping in. And it was already a process, like I said, that has been ongoing for a long time. America is apparently a declining power, much like Spain was back in the late 19th century when we declared war against them and took the Philippines and Cuba from them. But now it's our turn. Apparently, we've been declining on our own for decades, and now China's taking advantage of that. And now Trump's come in and made it even worse, I guess, or he's accelerating it if he succeeds in what he's done. He is succeeding in what he's doing, really.
Well, he's creating more opportunities for China to move forward in what it was already pursuing as its international strategy.
Yeah, Xi Jinping spoke in Davos fairly recently, didn't he?
It was a year ago right now, this weekend, or at the close of this week. I think tomorrow Trump's flying over there to give a closing speech on Friday, but they've been meeting over there. It's where all the super rich of the world get together and lay their plans for whatever they're laying plans for. And I've heard recent criticism of the press being excluded. That's why some reporters haven't been going there, because they're more or less kept outside where they can't come in and try to talk individually and get more of the goings on. But it was a year ago at the Davos gathering where Xi Jinping made his statement promoting international trade. This was, of course, right after the inauguration and Trump declaring America first now in his inaugural address, and President Xi was making the declaration that we stand here ready to support the international free trade regime.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, there was a World Economic Forum, I think, recently, and it may have been that same forum where America's representative showed up the first day, made a speech, and left.
Yeah, that was a different one.
Yeah,
I think it was in Morocco, I believe.
But yeah, and another retired.
And the Chinese hung around and were
bragging about how they are now the protectors and guarantors of world global investment and things like that. And they've also invested. You mentioned the One Belt One Road, which is spreading. I mean, China is investing $1 trillion. They expect to invest $1 trillion, but in cooperation with all the other countries that are getting involved with their One Belt One Road initiative, they're expecting somewhere around $7 trillion to be invested by all the other countries cooperatively with China to build roads, infrastructure, basically. To expand.
Yeah. It reaches in all directions, out from China down through Southeast Asia, down through South Central Asia and Pakistan, and towards the eastern end of the Mediterranean, which would give them transportation routes reaching on up into Eastern Europe.
Yeah, and at the same time, our country, our government is talking about pulling back and isolating ourselves, punishing trade partners for unfair trade practices, so to speak, and we're setting the stage for China, apparently, and apparently that's what a lot of other countries are also saying. I've got a quote here from a Major General Jin Yinan, a strategist at China's National Defense University. In a recent speech, well, actually it was January 20th of this year, he gave a speech to Communist Party officials where he stated he celebrated America's pullout from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He says that we are quiet about it, he said. We repeatedly state that Trump harms China. We want to keep it that way. In fact, he has given China a huge gift. That is the American withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He says that as the U.S. retreats globally, China shows up. And that seems to be the case, although, like I said, we've been declining for quite some time. And China really, wasn't it their previous premier that had the plan for the future that Xi Jinping is now really accelerating? Do you remember that?
I can't speak to that.
Yeah, I don't either, but...
They through the decades they've had their 5-year plans where they would lay out, and so it's a longer view of their plans, their strategies.
Yes, they are planning ahead, but of course they have a government that can do that.
Yeah, they don't have government shutdowns every month or two.
Well, the government has a lot more unchecked power too, which is not good, of course, but there are benefits to that sort of thing. You can go too far in either direction, really, and it just seems like our government now, for lots and lots of reasons, is basically ineffective or destructive.
Yeah, that's a whole other angle on what's going on here.
Yeah, I don't want to get too far into that, but that's just part of our deterioration, I guess. I mean, anybody who says that our government is not dysfunctional isn't paying attention, in my opinion. But I would like to point out now that Trump has cut or wants to cut funding, or has cut funding, I think, to the State Department and all kinds of foreign service. Is he not? He's cutting it drastically.
Well, I don't know that they've actually passed a budget. They've had these continuing resolutions to kind of keep things going. But his skinny budget that we talked about in an earlier program, it was just a few pages introduced or presented by the White House that showed in broad numbers what they wanted. That did have a huge cut to the State Department.
Yeah. Well, and the reason I mention that is because I got a paragraph here circled from Evan Osnos's New Yorker article that states here, China is negotiating with at least 16 countries to form the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a free trade zone that excludes the United States, which are proposed in 2012 as a response to the TPP.
Right.
So we initially, I guess under Obama, got involved with the TPP. So China started up this Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership in response, and then we pull out a TPP, and China just says, well, hey, we have this deal already made up.
Open for business.
Yeah, and it says here, if the deal is signed next year as projected, it will create the world's largest trade bloc by population. You know, what more can China ask for than for us to abdicate our role in the world, you know? And they're taking advantage of it, apparently.
Yeah, that article that you're talking about from the New Yorker also goes to some length talking about China's view of Trump and how their view evolved. And at first, after the election, they were concerned about him because of all his rhetoric during the campaign. But then, after they had meetings with him and met with him at Mar-a-Lago, and then later when he came to Beijing, they figured out how to deal with him and his interest in pomp and ceremony more than in policy, and his
flattery.
lack of familiarity with the details of the policy, and his failure to have his facts because he didn't bother to get effectively briefed by the briefings that were available to him. And similar criticism about this is in a more recent article, I think it's in the current issue of the New Yorker, about Jared Kushner and his dealings with China and his rejection of contributions from the experts who could brief him, or even excluding them from the meetings. He's had at least one meeting in private with the Chinese ambassador to the United States, and then one meeting where it was with Michael Flynn.
This is Kushner you're talking about, right?
Kushner,
China, yeah.
with the Chinese ambassador to the United States, and some speculation about mixing private business with public policy in those private discussions.
Yeah, you have to wonder if maybe the Trump people are a foreign mole, you know, put in there or taken advantage of as a saboteur of the United States, you know. But that's a bit far.
Yeah, well, there are probably a variety of different spins person could speculate on as to what's going on there. But there are some similarities between the relationship between the Trump administration in China and Trump administration figures with Putin and the Russians.
Yeah, yep, and yeah, it is, and it's probably just natural because he's been involved in international business all of his life, I guess, and I'm sure Kushner has too. But it's still an opportunity for foreign powers to take advantage, and knowing Trump, you know, as well as we do, or from what we've seen, and it's
yeah. Well, there's a lot of reporting out there about financial backing for projects by Trump and Kushner coming from the Russians and from the Chinese. There's a similarity in that regard as well.
Yep. Yeah, and we don't hear a lot about the Chinese connection, so to speak, but yeah, who knows? Anyway, you're listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought. We're talking about whether or not America is being made great again, or is perhaps something else going on like China being made great again. What about investment in Africa? The United States is cutting way back on its investment there, with the exception of the military, where we talked about that on a previous show, where we've got military bases, or at least troops, all over the African continent. But isn't China investing tremendously in Africa also?
They are. I don't have a lot of detail on that, but I know part of the One Road, One Belt was reaching over into East Africa, around the Horn of Africa, and then also they're funding educational programs in universities in Africa, and students there can study Mandarin.
Yeah,
in Africa, and then they offer scholarships programs and free visas for African students to come study at universities in China. So they're making connections there, which is similar to what the Russians were doing or the Soviets were doing with African students way back before the fall of the Soviet Union, where there were a lot of African students that would come to study in the Soviet Union. It'd be interesting to know whether they're meeting, whether the African students in China are meeting the same kinds of racial discrimination that they encountered when they were students in the Soviet Union back in that era.
Yeah.
Because there has been some news out about racial animosity within China towards minority factions.
Yeah. Well,
because China itself, from what I've read, is regarded as one nation because of its language and culture, not because of ethnicity. I think we touched on that on one of our programs. We were talking about races and ethnicities, and so even though they share a common sense of being of the Chinese nation because of their language and culture, there are a lot of different. There's a lot of diversity within the borders.
Yeah,
of
a lot
China.
of dialects, a lot of different
dialects, different languages.
Yeah.
I mean, they from what I've read, the written language can be read anywhere, but the spoken language is great variety. Where sometimes, I mean, it might be different for someone from the Bronx to understand someone from Birmingham.
Vocal inflection,
but even more than greater difference than that.
Yeah, that's why I was surprised that they're teaching Mandarin. I guess that's a fairly widespread, widely spoken language in China because they're teaching it in foreign countries. And I might add, much like English was the second language of all of the major countries in the world, and still is for the most part.
Yeah, and then for a while, French was the diplomatic language for international affairs, and then, of course, you can go back to the Romans and Latin being the language.
Yeah, and it all seems to me as though, like I said, America is a waning industrial or empire, basically, and just like all the previous empires throughout history, and we're on the way down, and other people are on the way up, other countries are on the way up, I think, and it was going to happen, I think, whether Trump was elected or not, but he seems to be accelerating things and pushing things farther along.
Yeah, it sounds like he's created openings to make it easier one of the quotes, I believe, in this New York article was, how long will China be doing this? And say, as long as Trump's in office, because they don't know what's coming next. That's one thing. The unpredictability of the political direction of the United States from election to election, so that Chinese or any other foreign country can't really say with certainty what to expect. I mean, since the end of the Second World War, the United States was regarded as being a stable democracy that espoused certain values, although in practice, if you look at what the CIA has done in countries around the world, it's not really lived up to those ideals in many instances. I mean, even in that article from the New Yorker, they also quoted President Eisenhower making a statement in 1959, I believe, about the United States standing for these principles, and yet Eisenhower presided over the 1953 coup that overthrew the democratically elected government in Iran.
Oh, he was involved.
Shah. So that was like 6 years before he makes this declaration about the United States standing for all these values.
No, he was a major. He approved almost every single CIA intervention, so to speak, during his two terms. He really did it, and he disrupted. Yeah, I have the quote here. He stated that, quote, we could be the wealthiest and the most mighty nation and still lose the battle of the world if we do not help our world neighbors protect their freedom and advance their social and economic progress, he said. And that right there kind of surprised me because, well, not surprised me, but it rang a bell because that's how we are. We assume that our values are everybody else's values, and we are going to help them have the things that we value, and not all cultures want those things.
There's that, and then there's also the inconsistency between his words and his acts.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We talk about freedom. Of course, I guess we're talking about freedom and social economic progress. That was in comparison to the propaganda perspective of the Soviet Union and how they were all backward and everything, which, of course, from what I've seen, they weren't anywhere near as bad as they were made out to be to us. Although, from what I also understand, the Eastern European countries under the Soviet domination were. But yeah, his words and deeds did not match. And there was another quote here from Li Ziguo from the China Institute of International Studies, where it states that by setting more of the world's rules, and he's talking about China taking a more dominant role now in the world, he says, by setting more of the world's rules, China hopes to, quote, break the Western moral advantage, which identifies good and bad political systems. And I never really thought about it, but that's exactly how our government has always talked about other countries. Oh, they're free, they're democratic, that means they're good. Or they're tyrannical and communist or socialist, and therefore they're bad. But here again, you know, we still deal with countries that are tyrannical if it benefits us to trade with them, you know, so the words and deeds don't match there either. But it's interesting that we have historically viewed the entire world as with us or against us, basically, based on their political systems and nothing more. And we don't even live up to our own ideals, you know.
Yeah, well, perhaps it's more whether we benefit from their economic system rather than their political system.
Well, that's what I'm saying, yeah.
So it's like, follow the money.
Right. Well, yeah, of course. I mean, we dealt with one of the reasons why Hitler was allowed to go for as long as he was because the investment house where the Dulles brothers worked during that time had a whole bunch of money that they'd loaned to Hitler, and they didn't want him to default on all these loans. Mm-hmm. So they didn't want us to go to war and wreck their investors' fortunes. And of course, they ended up, you know, profiting from the war once it did start, and you know, but we didn't care what Hitler was. We were investing in it, and we were making money.
Well, those individuals were.
Those individuals, right? Yeah, well, those individuals are Americans, though,
and they had a lot of political pull.
Right. Well, Lang, we're out of time, and we did end up bashing America and Trump, but well, it came naturally, I guess. You've been listening to Wayne Parker and Lang Baker here on A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. We're out of time. We got to go. You have a good night.